Good morning, everyone. I'd like to actually call this monthly task force meeting to order. I'd like to begin with roll call, and please give us your name and who you represent. I'll start with myself. I'm Clifford Gilmore. I'm representing the SRO Central City SRO Collaborative Task Force.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a community advocate at the Asian Law Caucus.
Hi, I'm Angela Ju with the Chinatown SRO Collaborative.
Larry Kessler with the Department of Public Health in the Housing Program.
Judah Buckta with Mission Housing.
Hi, I'm Diana Martinez. I'm with the Mission SRO Collaborative. Good morning.
Good morning, Sam Ray, City Attorney's Office.
Bruce Burge, SRO Operator.
Sam Patel, SRO Operator.
Jordan Davis, SRO Tenant.
Christina Dang, Housing Inspector at DBI.
Jennifer Chung-Ju, Administrative Support.
Thank you all. So I determined that we do have a quorum. I'd like to begin. Hopefully, each one of you have either an agenda in front of you. If you do not, please let me know. Also, members should have also in your packet a copy of the minutes from the March meeting, which we will now take a moment to review the minutes from the March meeting for your review, changes or amendments too. So I'll give you a full moment to look over the minutes from last month's meeting. Are there any changes, corrections, or amendments to the minutes? If not, I'd like to entertain a motion that the minutes be approved. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Sure, I'll go out there.
Okay, Bruce.
Burge.
Bruce. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor of approving the minutes, show of hands.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Minutes have been adopted. Thank you all. Our next item is we have a presentation from Lauren, who is here on behalf of Catherine on the Asian Law Caucus. It's around presentation on immigration rights in SROs. So we're going to ask Lauren that you start your presentation now, roughly 15 to 20 minutes, and then if you have questions, I'm sure Lauren will be able to address your question.
Mm-hmm. So this is Lauren. She mentioned that she's a community advocate at Asian Law Caucus. As many of you know, is a nonprofit organization that focuses on civil rights and legal rights of the community, and you do not have to be Asian to get the services at Asian Law Caucus. They also have clinic hours for the housing program. She specifically worked for the housing program, and they represent tenants in San Francisco specifically. So they deal with a lot of rent board hearings. They do deal with summons and complaints. Also, they do outreach and also organizing efforts as well. So this is Lauren, and I'm sorry I have to head out, but I just wanted to introduce Lauren to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
So just before you begin, Lauren, on the minutes, I certainly didn't ask for public comments, but
sorry.
Hearing none, we'll move forward. Please, so now that we are on the record, if you may have a question, may comment, please tell us your name and who you are.
Can you identify?
Oh, sure. So my name is Christina Dang. I'm the housing inspector for DBI.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right. So, hi folks. I guess I just wanted to start off first with sort of like a roll call of who's in the room. Can I see if there's any, who of you all are representing tenant orgs or are tenants themselves at SROs?
I'm a tenant myself.
We work with tenants in SROs.
Okay, all right. And there's also Mission, yeah.
Mission SRO Collaborative.
Okay, great. And are any folks representing like government departments or anything? Yeah. Okay. And any like property managers or landlords? Okay, good to know. Good mix of folks. All right. Before I start, I just kind of wanted to poll and see what kind of issues you've been facing or questions that you might have so that I can think about them and try to address them through the presentation or at the end. Anything anybody wants to bring up now?
Well, I was a graduate of the Mission SRO Collaborative's Leadership Academy, which involved a lot of outreaches to hotels in the Mission, which, as you know, has a lot of immigrants from Mexico as well as Central and South America. And one of the big problems is we have in the nonprofit hotels, at least they're very non-cooperative with ICE, but there's been a lot of harassment of tenants, and there's also the possibility that a property manager or somebody who works at the place could let ICE in without a judicial warrant. And I hope you can also touch on the difference between judicial warrant and their own administrative detainers.
So the harassment of tenants in for-profit.
For-profit. It's usually for-profit, but we need to make sure that property owners don't let ICE in without a judicial warrant.
Yeah. And then the difference between a judicial warrant and
when they're detained and they're own internal detainers.
Okay. Can you identify yourself?
Jordan Davis, tenant rep.
Okay. Thank you, Jordan.
Hi, my name is Ian Fregosi. I'm with Supervisor Sandra Fewer's office. I came because of the discussion about the passed legislation. Should I sit here?
Are there any other issues that folks in the room are facing or would like to get addressed? Okay, sounds good. I'll ask again at the end if there are any questions that come up. So I guess I'll start off with a little bit of background. As a lot of you may already know, SROs are really attractive to new immigrants because they often act as an immigrant gateway to the U.S. They're a place where the housing is affordable, and not only that, but because they're communities where other immigrants are dense and living together, it's also a space that can feel safe and familiar because other folks are speaking the same language as you or have the same cultural values as you. Because of that, we've noticed that a lot of tenants can have a cultural difference with their landlords. Landlords might not understand or have the cultural competency to understand what tenants are going through. So some of these might be, as an immigrant or undocumented tenant, you might be especially afraid of retaliation. And that might come through in the way of not asking for repairs to be made because you don't want to be seen as someone who's making trouble, or think that because you're asking for so much that that invites poor treatment or retaliation. And a lot of times maybe a language barrier might keep the tenants, undocumented immigrant tenants, from speaking to their landlords because they feel embarrassment, or they're just not sure how to convey their concerns to the landlord. For the landlords and property managers, it's really important then to build a good relationship with trust with your tenants, because this not only makes the tenants feel safe, but it also ensures that your building will be kept in a good condition. They'll let you know if they see something that's potentially dangerous or something structurally unsound with the building. If they feel that they can trust you and that they won't be retaliated against for bringing it up. One of the suggestions we've had for landlords or property managers is to maybe offer an anonymous suggestion box so that tenants don't feel like they have to be the one to stand out to say, I want to point out this issue, right? So that way that they can point out an issue in the building and have it addressed without, bringing attention to themselves if they're not comfortable with it. Another important thing to note is that the issues I'll be talking about today don't necessarily cover folks in federally subsidized housing, such as low-income housing tax credits or Section 8. Most of the rules still apply, but if you are a tenant in the situation or have tenants in the situation, it's important to note that the situation might be different, or how you can resolve issues with your landlords. There might be a specified grievance process depending on which program you're in. So some of the issues that we've noticed tenants face and that landlords and property managers have to deal with is issues of language access. So one of the things that we want to remind property managers, and that you can tell your property manager or landlord, is that if you negotiate a lease in a non-English language, and it's one of the top 5 most populous languages in San Francisco, the landlord is required to then translate the lease into that language. So those languages include Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, Spanish, and Korean. So our suggestion is for landlords and property managers to play it safe, just get it all translated. And for tenants, if you do negotiate a lease in a different language, to make sure you let your landlord know that they should have it translated so that you can understand all the terms and conditions that you've already negotiated. Additionally, another issue that a lot of undocumented and immigrant tenants face is issues of fair housing. So this actually comes through in a lot of different ways. This can be how the landlord or property manager advertises, how they filter applications, how they give preferential treatment to certain repairs or access to amenities. So this is something that's come up recently, but Facebook has options to say I want this ad to go to specific races or to not go to specific races, and that would be a violation of fair housing. You're supposed to advertise equally. You're not supposed to say this building would be best for people with families, or it would be best for if my tenants spoke English, right? These things can be inadvertent, but they are violation of fair housing laws. And this applies to all housing providers, so all people at all steps of the ladder, so the landlord, the owner, property managers, the employees, the realtors, they're all supposed to comply with these laws. So if anybody's violating fair housing, such as whether they're when they're screening tenants, or when maybe they're giving preferential treatment in terms of access to public space, or the laundry room to certain tenants over others, all employees in the process are supposed to be in compliance with this. It's not just the owner. So I'm going to go a little bit into specifically immigration status and undocumented tenants, but forgive me, I'm not too familiar with it. Hopefully Catherine will get here in time to explain more if you have any questions specifically about these. But one of the things to note for tenants that is in California, private landlords can't inquire about immigration status. According to the California Civil Code 1940.3, landlords, all employees cannot ask about your status or require that you disclose your immigration status as part of the screening or application process. Additionally, a new bill was passed. Do you want to finish up? Okay. So a new bill was passed last year called AB 291. Maybe some of you have heard about it. But it ensures that landlords cannot intimidate a tenant to leave due to the immigration status of the tenant or their family. So they can't say, pay rent on time, or I'm going to call ICE. Those types of behaviors are no longer allowed. And they also prevent landlords from disclosing if they know their tenant's immigration status to ICE, to harass, intimidate, or retaliate against their tenants if they're unhappy with their tenants for whatever reason. Also, landlords cannot evict because the tenants have a certain immigration status. This can also be used in a defense in eviction if the tenant believes that they have been evicted because of their immigration status. One landlord attorney has put it this way. So it means that this law highlights the duty of landlords to be very careful and responsible with the information that they glean from their tenants, right? To not, haphazardly or inadvertently disclose this information about their tenants' immigration status in a way that could intimidate or make tenants feel unsafe. Okay. So yeah, did you have a question, Jordan?
Yeah, I just
Could you, for the record, identify?
for the record, Jordan Davis. This bill is AB 291 that was passed last year. It was sponsored by David Chu, who represents the most of the SROs in the city. And my big question is, is there anything preventing landlords, let's say ICE comes to your hotel and inquires with the desk or the landlord about a certain tenant, and they don't have a judicial warrant, they only have an administrative detainer. Would AB 291 prevent that from happening?
So,
yeah,
sorry, my name is Catherine Chu. So I work with Lauren over at the caucus. So what AB 291 actually does, it expands an existing civil code protection, which is codified as 1940.3. It adds 1940.35. And it also adds to 1940.2. So if anyone wants to see the actual legal text, that's where you can go, and you can always email one of us and we can send it to you. The other thing that landlords can't do, is they can't influence someone to leave. I don't know if Lauren already covered that, but that's kind of a more subtle thing that this protects on. So the question on ICE coming, ICE raids essentially, coming to homes, coming to workplaces, that's not the work that the housing program necessarily does. That's usually more of our immigration program, and they work with a bunch of other immigration orgs that you can call if there is a question on ICE coming to your home or your workplace or something like that, that they can give you more exact guidance on that. The question was if there's something that can prevent landlords from cooperating.
Some kind of this AB 291, forbids landlords from sharing information about tenants with absent a judicial warrant.
So the one thing that was probably covered was that the one distinction that we have to make is that this is not a public housing issue, right? So if you have a subsidized residential building, then it's HUD funded or something like that, then that's separate from the private properties that we're talking about. I don't think anything necessarily prevents a landlord from doing that, because that just kicks in immigration consequences and not housing consequences, right? So yeah, it's one of those trickier points, because it's less about the eviction and tenant protection section than it is just about pure immigration law, which we are not experts on.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to but I've been in conversation with Ronan's office about how to policies that would further restrict SRO owners and operators from sharing information about tenant, or letting ICE into their building without a judicial warrant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a trickier issue.
Exactly. We're really testing the fences there.
Yeah, there are optional things like sanctuary workplaces, essentially. So this would be the kind of housing analogy to a sanctuary workplace would be a sanctuary residential building. So some, I don't know if any SROs do this, but I know some other big housing facilities do say that their housing facility is a sanctuary housing facility, and their policy is to not cooperate with ICE. But again, we're not the immigration experts, and that's definitely more immigration territory than housing territory.
Hi, I'm Diana Martinez, for the record. I read about AB 291 and that although landlords and property management are not allowed to share immigration status, there was something about unless because they're complying with federal law or something of that nature,
Right.
then they would have to. So can you elaborate more on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that's the way that usually comes up is in the context of public housing versus private housing. So an example would be if there's HUD, so like the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, if there's HUD funding for a building, part of that funding that comes from federal money requires certain information. Included in that information is immigration status, because that kicks in the ability to be eligible for these benefits. So if you're getting federal money and you have to determine the eligibility of your tenants in order to get federally subsidized money, that's generally where that complying with federal law comes into play in residential housing. That's why the caveat to whatever we're talking about today is that this generally is better used in the private housing context.
It could also be used in in certain like nonprofit housing contexts, because I know there's a nonprofit housing development that doesn't like take into account immigration status, and like this or city funded housing network that might have different rules than say HUD.
Right. So city funding again is not federal money, so that's exactly right. The distinction is federally subsidized, or if it's a part of some federal program, because the federal immigration, like there's no federal sanctuary policies, so that's kind of what this separates it.
Also, if a tenant receives a voucher, for example, like a housing voucher that's issued by HUD, then that would, I mean, technically they could be in private housing with that voucher, but who would be restricted from giving status in a situation like this?
That's a really good question, and it like I'm assuming when you say voucher, you mean like the Section 8 housing choice voucher. I don't actually know, but again, it's one of those things where we would encourage landlords to protect themselves essentially, and to really check and see if it's something that they have to comply with, because the difference there is that the landlord themselves are not checking for benefits, right? Like they are not checking the eligibility of the tenant to qualify for Section 8. The tenant is going through a separate process, right? They're going through San Francisco Housing Authority probably in order to get that voucher. And so SFHA would be the one to have to check eligibility, not the landlord.
Okay, so the landlord wouldn't even necessarily know.
I would argue that they would fall into the 1940 code section where they couldn't ask, right? Because if I come to you as a landlord and say, I have this voucher, and I'm a tenant or I want to be a tenant, right? I already have the voucher, so there's no eligibility status that you need to check. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure.
Angela, what about public housing? Is that considered city funding or federal funding?
It depends on the housing. There's federal and there's cities. So.
Like a conventional housing?
It really, I can't say in such broad strokes. It really depends on the particular building you're talking about. So I would check in. I would check in and see what type of funding that housing is getting.
It's funded to Housing Authority, San Francisco Housing Authority.
So my understanding that the Housing Authority does get some federal money, but I don't know, again, unless, like, I can't say, because I don't know if some buildings are only city money or some are only federal money or a mix of both, right? Like I can't just say every public housing, it, you know, falls under this or not. It really depends on what that specific building is getting.
Any other questions or comments on this item? Okay. Are there any public comments? Hearing none. Thank you so much for your presentation. We appreciate this. Thank you for being here and providing us this valuable information. Okay. Thank you so much. All righty. Our next item are administrative announcements. Are there any announcements?
The only announcement I really want to make is that today at Budget Committee they're going to be having a hearing about homelessness and budget priorities, and I just want to put that out there. It's at 1 p.m. 250 City Hall, City Hall Room 250. It's just a good way to speak about these priorities, and since it interfaces with the SRO issues so much that I'm just putting it out there. And that's Jordan Davis.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Okay, any other announcements? Hearing none, I'm going to move on to item number 6. And I see that we have a staff member here from Supervisor Feuer's office. This is on the Operating and Maintenance Pass-Through Reform Bill. And I'm going to ask that, what's your name?
Ian Fregosi.
Okay, Ian is going to talk about this legislation, and from there, Ian will field questions, and as task members, we'll take your comments, questions upon you completing your presentation.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to pass around a fact sheet. I have, I think, 10. I don't know, so I might be short a couple here. But yeah, thank you all for having me here. So I want to talk about the legislation that we have that Supervisor Feuer introduced on April 3rd for operating and maintenance pass-throughs to remove the ability of landlords to pass on debt service and property tax increases due to newly purchasing property. But first, so before I get into that, how many folks are familiar with pass-through petitions that landlords can file? Okay, great. So basically, the idea of these petitions are to allow landlords to pass through additional costs that exceed what they are already allowed to increase rent with the annual allowable increase. So every year, landlords are allowed to increase their rents by it's 60% of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And the reason that they have that is because things, increase in price over time, and this annual allowable increase is meant to cover those price increases that usually follow inflation. So what these petitions cover is additional costs that go above and beyond when landlords incur costs that are above and beyond the normal inflationary sort of expenses. So there are many different types of pass-through petitions. There's capital improvement pass-throughs, which is when landlords do some sort of big capital improvement, whether that's putting a new roof on or painting the house, doing some sort of big improvement. That is separate from this. Other pass-throughs are like water, bond pass-throughs. There's all kinds of different pass-throughs. The only pass-through petition that this legislation affects is for operating and maintenance. And operating and maintenance pass-throughs are specifically supposed to be for costs, again, that exceed for landlords when their costs of operating and maintaining buildings, residential buildings for tenants, when those costs exceed the annual allowable rent increase. And so what the issue with this is that we have found, and that many tenant organizations have found, and tenants living in a lot of large buildings, is that property tax increases because of new property acquisitions and the debt service associated with them, so the mortgage that landlords take out in order to purchase new properties, are not actually operating and maintenance expenses. So tenants are living in these buildings. They are purchased by a new landlord, oftentimes large real estate investors, and the costs of purchasing that building are then being passed on as operating and maintenance expenses. So the tenants aren't actually getting any sort of maintenance to their buildings or any sort of improvements. This is just the costs of acquiring this new building being offset on the tenants by way of a 7% rent increase. So when this pass-through is granted by the rent board, the tenants in that building can get up to a 7% permanent rent increase. So that this is added to their base rent. And that's on top of the annual allowable increase. So after that, that's about a 9, usually about a 9, almost 10% rent increase just for this. So what this legislation would do is remove the ability of landlords to, when they purchase new properties, to offset their costs of investment onto the tenants, and no longer allow this burden to be put onto tenants. And so again, landlords would still be able to have the ability to pass through capital improvements or water bonds, all those other costs, and within operating and maintenance expenses, they can still pass through the true operating and maintenance expenses, whether that's, if the garbage bills go up dramatically or they have to do some sort of a routine maintenance, that will still be allowed to pass through. The only thing that will not be allowed to pass through now is the debt service and the increases in property taxes due to the property changing hands. So I hope I was able to kind of cover that. Does anybody have any questions on that? Yep.
Yeah, what's the average increase?
The average increase?
Yeah, you said up to 7%. Is there an average?
A lot of times, the petitions that we've seen, they almost always hit that 7% threshold. So they get to the top.
Okay, that really didn't answer my question.
What are the so I don't know what the average is. I would say it's if it's not 7, it's close to 7%. I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Clifford Gilmore for the record. So in terms of the data on these petitions, can you give us some indication of the number of petitions in the fiscal year, that whether they've increased, stayed about the same?
Right. Over the last several years, they've definitely increased. I don't actually have the chart here with me now, where you can see where they started. But over the last year, there is about 118 of these operating and maintenance petitions in the pipeline, and over, I think it's 53 were filed between December 11th, when there was an article posted in the San Francisco Chronicle announcing that Supervisor Fewer was moving forward with legislation that was going to close this loophole and no longer allow debt service and property tax increases to be passed through. So there was a pretty good number of those that were filed after that article came out. So, but it's about 100 and, like I said, about 118 in the last year.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, Bruce Burge. Of the 118, first let me take exception with the loophole comment,
Sure.
because it's not a loophole. It's written in the law. It's absolutely allowed. It's not a loophole.
Right.
But second, of those 118, how many are directly affecting SRO and 500 SRO hotels in San Francisco?
I don't actually know the answer in terms of SRO specifically. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, but you're right. It's not. It is written into the law. I guess the reason why I would say this is a loophole. I mean, we're actually the only rent-controlled jurisdiction that still allows debt service to be passed through, and it's actually been banned recently by Oakland and San Jose in the last few years. They no longer allow that to be passed through, and again, it only really affects new purchasers of property. When we've seen, for instance, like Veritas is the biggest landlord in the city. They've bought 250 buildings throughout the city, and this is like a pretty standard way that they're able to to put the costs, to offset costs of investment onto the tenants living there.
How many of those 250 buildings were SROs that Veritas approved?
I don't know.
Yeah, none.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you're also aware, and we don't do this. I mean, we just don't file these petitions because they're pointless.
Mm-hmm.
You're also aware that in the SRO community, whenever there's an O&M pass-through proposed and it gets approved, everybody just claims hardship. All the tenants just claim a hardship.
Do you know how many tenants, like what the percent, like how many tenants usually claim the hardship?
Yeah, like 90% out of a building.
In an SRO?
Yeah.
Oh, in the SRO.
Because they're all on fixed income.
Okay.
They're all disability or Social Security, so there is no pass-through.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fiction. So quite frankly, we don't do that. We don't do capital improvement pass-throughs, we don't do property tax pass-throughs, we don't do debt service pass-throughs, we don't do anything.
So this wouldn't really affect.
No, we don't care. Go ahead.
Okay.
For the record,
Yeah.
Angela.
It's good that you don't do those pass-throughs, but I do know that some tenants in SROs receive these pass-throughs. And even though they might be able to do hardship if they're really below the income, but it's still something that could provide less burdensome to tenants. Like you have all these pass-throughs coming to you, and if it's not in fact that they are eligible to do away with these pass-throughs, then this legislation is actually protecting people who are not protected by hardship. I mean, tenants without hardship doesn't mean that they can afford increases. So that's what I mean. If it doesn't affect your properties, your way of operation, that's great. I think that this legislation would help.
Sure,
people.
next year we will see that 60% of CPI is just too much. So we should reduce that to 40% of CPI because landlords are getting over a 50% increase in CPI every year. You know, the truth of the matter is we don't even pass through those. It's just not worth
The
passing.
annual allowable
Yeah,
increase.
such a small amount.
Mm-hmm.
About 1% on somebody paying $300.
Yeah.
How about $135?
Well, I know, we got those too, but that's rare. Yeah, that deals with it. So, Bruce Burge, again for the record, we certainly don't oppose your legislation because we don't think it's going to affect us directly, but we think it's bad legislation. We also take exception to the fact that it's based on a San Francisco Chronicle article.
You mean in terms of the effective date?
Well, I don't care about the effective date, is that that's what prompted all of this. We're reusing newspapers now to formulate legislation.
No. The reason that the article was published was because we were introducing legislation.
I'm sorry, that's not how I read that. I may have read it wrong.
Yeah. So it was announced in the Chronicle that Supervisor Fewer was going to be introducing legislation to no longer allow debt service and property taxes to be passed through to tenants. And so that was publicly noticed in the San Francisco Chronicle.
Yeah, I may have read it wrong then. I apologize.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Diana Martinez for the record. I have a question. You mentioned that recently Oakland and San Jose did something similar.
Yeah.
And that, you know, there are other jurisdictions who have something similar in place. Is there any data on those cities as to how it's affected rents in those buildings or any other effects that came of that?
I don't know of any data. I mean, I know that because that's no longer allowed, and you know, obviously, this is one less way that the rents are able to be hiked. You know, by up to, I don't know if it's 7% of those ones, but no, I don't know what the data is on that yet.
Well, I think that this is good legislation because we are seeing in the mission, I guess, I wouldn't call it, I guess right now it's a slow trickle, but I think it'll get faster and more frequent with gentrification, but we are seeing more SROs changing hands. And as I'm specifically thinking about, there are a few, but I'm really worried about what's going to happen with the Graywood Hotel because I do know the new owners are planning on doing capital improvements pass-through, and I imagine they would want to do this type of a pass-through too.
And they newly purchased the property recently?
Yes, they have.
Right.
Sam Patel. I had a question regarding, in my opinion, this thing more impacts the apartment building owners than the SROs do. And you pointed out two of them being pretty much half the culprits, Veritas and Dallas. I'll have your office or Supervisor Fuhr's office considered that they might take aggressive eviction tactics if this thing does pass through? Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is sort of being used. I mean, that's kind of what this is doing already because of the fact that if tenants are seeing these steep rent increases, because it's not just this is just one of, like I said, several different pass-throughs, oftentimes compiled on top of each other. I mean, I just got a email, sent to our office yesterday about someone who's experienced, they're in a Veritas building and they have a 15% rent increase because of, this being 7% of it, and then water bonds, and then banked pass-throughs that they have over the last 3 years. So there's a lot of, I mean, when you sort of compile all these different pass-throughs on tenants at the same time, it makes it pretty easy to push people out of those buildings. And whether or not that's intentional, I mean, I can't speculate on that, but I mean, we do know that that's happening. Yeah. So this is one way to decrease that burden. And we think that this is pretty blatant. I mean, it's one thing to improve your building and want to recoup some of the costs for improving your building. It's a whole other thing to have an investment strategy that relies on the tenants that are already living there offsetting your investments, your costs, that they have no, decision. They have no part in that decision. Yeah.
Bruce Burge again. So, and I'm sorry, I haven't had time to read this whole thing. What about refis? I own a building. I've got $1 million mortgage. I decide I need to do something. I remortgage it, take $2 million out, and I've got a $3 million mortgage. Can I pass that through?
This would not allow debt service to be passed through, so no.
So no refinance, no improvements of the building.
Not for operating and maintenance, no. Yeah. So if you're doing,
we're good.
Yeah. If you're doing improvements, then
A
yeah.
follow-up question. So if it's for capital, I take out a loan for capital improvements.
Then that's different. That's a capital.
So that's a
improvement.
pass-through.
Right, that's different.
But you're
yeah.
passing through the capital improvement, not the debt service.
Well, but the cost of doing the capital improvement.
Yeah.
Right.
If you take out money and go to Reno for with it.
I understand that, but you don't get to pass through the interest or the points or anything else. It's just the money that you, always bet on one. You don't get your fees.
I just want to,
For the record.
for the record, Jordan Davis, I just want to point out for context that even though we don't know like how many hotels will be are being currently affected by this, but it's but the thing is, like, private SROs are covered under the rent ordinance, pretty much every one of them, since many of them were built before 1979. So this would potentially this could hurt, and it would have a benefit to SRO tenants in private hotels. And plus there's a lot of speculation going on, like there's a lot of there's a lot of private landlords that'll do anything to increase rent, even in SROs, which have been like the lifeline housing. The cost has gone up. They've been using all these tricks. So there's been some bad apple landlords that have been using all these tricks. So this is just putting some context in there.
Clifford Gilmore for the record. I was going to ask you, Ian, about so the two different particularly types of owners that this would affect. So I think Bruce really touched upon it, that so maybe there's more investment groups rather than family-owned businesses that actually have filed more of these petitions.
Yeah,
Would that be accurate?
definitely. Yes, the vast majority. Yeah.
Jordan Davis for the record again. These investment groups are like purchasing SROs and flipping them into tech dorms. So this could, like, these the pass-throughs that we're trying to ban now could be used as an incentive to push tenants out and replace them with tech dorms, which I'm hoping this legislation, if it passed, would try to stop. So that's just where I am on that.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Any public comments? Hearing none.
I'm actually going to entertain a motion for the task force to support this legislation and to write a letter of support to the Board of Supervisors. Anybody want a second?
I'll second. You seconded. Okay. All right. So, call the vote, and those in favor of the motion, by show of hands. You got it.
Okay.
Those opposed? Those those abstaining? Okay, so you have the count?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
All
Ian.
right.
Okay.
Thank you all.
All right. Our next item will be reports from the SRO collaboratives, discussion possible action. So I would like to open that up to any one of the collaboratives for, if you have a report, we'll hear it at this time.
This is Diana Martinez for the record of Mission SRO Collaborative. At the end of this month, our leadership program, the Peer Outreach Program, will graduate, so that is very exciting. And we are starting the recruitment process for the next cycle of the leadership program.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other report from collaboratives?
Perfect. Thank you.
From the SRO Families Collaborative, our families leadership training is ongoing, and we too will be graduating people in the mid-May, on May 10.
Okay. And Clifford Gilmore for the record for the Central City SRO Collaborative. On April 4th, we held a mayoral forum, which was extremely well attended. 6 of the 8 candidates who actually qualified for the ballot were in attendance. I think we had some 400 people there in attendance. There also was television media there and print media there, so it's a really, really, really good event. So I want to report that, back on that. All right. Any public comments? Hearing none, we will move on to future items, prioritization of future agenda items. Hearing.
I think I know like you wanted, this is Jordan Davis for the record, I know Clifford, you wanted like animal, something about animals, and hoping like, I definitely would like to see that. And
Okay.
also the 2 other things I want to talk about is like, the issue of right to pay rent by check, like talked about this last month. I'm entering, London Breed's office is entering into a collaborative process with HSH and several service providers to like examine rent payment options and not requiring people to have a payee. Like I know Tenderloin Housing Clinic allows people to get off the payee program, but some don't. So we're trying to like do that, and like we should be expecting something soon. Also, I wanted to bring up like the something on like master leasing, and or like I'd like to have like a presentation on like master leasing and the ins and outs, and also like subsidies like for people living in HSH HSH units, because like I'm paying more than half my rent and I'm supposedly in a city subsidized housing, so we need to have a discussion about that.
Okay. Thank you. Any other future items? Okay. Any public comments? Hearing none. That actually concludes. General public comments. Hearing none. That actually concludes our agenda for today. Thank you all so very much. And just one thing as we go, I know we're working toward this, and I appreciate everybody's effort for being here on time, and so we'll continue to strive, see if we can actually have our quorum exactly by 9 o'clock. That'd be great. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you all.
That's something I've been
Good job, Clifford.